Dave, I've got some news for you. My dad died in church last Sunday, which came as a big surprise to him because he was in the third row.
What?
The priest comes up and starts mass by saying, we'd like to remember, everybody remembering your prayers, John Guigar. He died at 5:30 this morning.
Oh, God.
And my dad looks over at Mom, and Mom looks over at him, and Dad's like, feeling his heart, I feel okay. And of course, they're shifting priests around all the time. So this priest didn't know my dad by sight.
Didn't know him. Oh, yeah.
So they go through the entire mass. Come to find out, there was a John Guigar spelled differently that did die at 5:30.
In Bad Axe, Michigan?
In Huron County.
Oh, Huron County, okay.
There was another John Guigar. It went to a different church, but also went to a Catholic church and so on and so forth. But they made it through mass, got out, and he said, that wasn't so bad, like the looks that I got in church walking out. But he said, I swear to God, every place I go, people are coming up to me saying, I thought you were dead. he's got to explain to people, no, I'm not pushing up the daisies. I've had a good look at the roots, but I'm still alive. And meanwhile, he goes out golfing that Sunday. My mom is fielding calls all day from well-wishers who heard that and of course, since she's 81, she's answering honestly, like they're like, oh, I just wanted to say John was such a good guy, and he's in a better place now. And my mom would say, no, well, he's on the 8th hole now. And they'd say, oh, yes, Rita, I like to think of it that way too. And she's trying to explain. I'll have him call you later. It's okay. She says, oh, that's such a sweet thought. My dad goes, I'd like to walk into the big boy just once without somebody fainting. He goes, we've had 3 revivals by the salad bar alone. So for weeks, people have been coming up saying, I thought you were dead, which I imagine when you're 80 years old is the last thing you want to hear.
Oh, my God. This is the most small town thing ever, too, because in a big city, you would never run into it or no one would care. No one, like you're in Philadelphia, I'm in Los Angeles. No one would care. You drop dead. No one notices. In a small town, though, that's like gossip fodder for 3 weeks. Oh, did you hear John Guigar died? Oh, yeah, 81. Yeah. Well, he had a good run. Oh, he was a bowling coach. Oh, God. And just fodder for weeks for a small town. They'll chew on that forever. Yeah. It's like cud with a cow. They'll just keep chewing on it. And there's a reason why you left Bad Axe. It's because of that small town gossip mill.
Oh,
it's like,
I know.
Oh, did you see Brad bought a new woven belt? Oh, yes. I don't know about that, boy.
You leave my woven belt out of this. I like that woven belt.
And on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to Woven Belts Emporium, also called ComicLab, the show about making comics
and making a living from comics. I'm Brad Guigar, the author of the Webcomics Handbook and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his still-kicking friend, Dave Kellett, cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We got an exciting show with 5 or 6 questions that we're really champing at the bit to talk about. Yeah. And I got to remind everybody that you could be watching this show live right now at patreon.com/ComicLab at the Live Gab group. At the $10 level, you can join us every week for a live presentation of the show. It is also archived if for life lessons or learning. If for some reason you need to miss it, you can watch the archive, but it is also streaming every Tuesday morning, and you can join us for the live chat that goes along with it. And Bradley, what is our first topic for today, my friend?
Oh, it's my favorite topic in the whole world, word balloons. Listen to this. This comes in from our friend
If you want
Jay
to talk sex appeal, here we go.
Oh, I love word balloons. Love them. Both of you, he says, use a variety of styles of word balloons throughout your comics, whether hand-drawn or digital. Sometimes they appear on top of characters or objects, other times behind. Sometimes they stick out of the boundary of the panel. Other times they're cut off by the panel. And sometimes you'll even get rid of the balloon altogether and just have the text hovering in the background. You used all these tools and styles to great effect. My question is, how do you decide what a given panel or situation calls for when it comes to the shape, placement, or other qualities of your word balloons? And he finishes up by saying, Team Word Balloon for the win. David.
All right. Well, there's actually a surprisingly large amount of fodder to be had in a question about word balloons, because there's sort of the silent partner. I see what I did there. Yeah. The silent partner of a comic strip, in that their sole job or their main job, I shouldn't say their sole job. Their main job is utilitarian, and partially it's to recede into the background so that you can get the words, but not in any way focus on the word balloons, focus on the words. It's to get you through the comic strip quickly and cleanly, unlike that sentence that I just said, and then you could focus on the art, right? So the main thing to talk about first is like, what are the main utilitarian approaches that you have to take towards a word balloon? One is you have to go left from right. Obviously, you would think that was an obviously. It's not. Some people cross the word balloon tails. They do all sorts of convoluted things to make a comic read left to right when just flipping characters would do the job. You have to start with the higher and moving to lower space. In general, you want to have, I would say, 3 word balloons or less per panel. Lord knows I've done more with 4 word balloons at a panel. But the idea being that the mind can only handle so much information per panel. You also want to have a consistent and clean negative space within the word balloon around the words so that they're enveloped comfortably. But again, the main purpose of that word balloon is to bring you the words without standing out. And so anything after that, Brad, becomes aesthetics, don't you think?
Yeah. At that point, it becomes what looks good and what's best for your composition. I'll give you an example. There's one type of word balloon that I use quite a bit. And I actually picked it up from looking at a Hagar the Horrible comic.
Wow. Okay.
I should check it out to see if it might be like a mainstay of his stuff. But what it is I take the word balloon and I overlap it so it's coming out of the border of the panel, and then I erase the line of the word balloon where it overlaps. And what that does is it opens up that panel into the outside gutter and the spaces around it.
You know what? I did that for about 8 or so years in Sheldon. I don't do it anymore, but yes, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And I love, in fact, I'm looking at, they might have gotten, or the new team might not be doing it as much, but I remember first seeing it as a kid in Hagar the Horrible and really loving it. Yeah, I don't see it anymore. So,
well, Brad, I think this goes back to one of our longstanding lessons, which is everything you need to know about comics you can learn in Hagar the Horrible. I think that
Hagar the Horrible, including learning that it's pronounced Hagar. I always used to call him Hagar the Horrible and got corrected a few times. But okay, so what does that do? Well, that opens up the panel. It introduces some air if you've got kind of a congested composition. It accounts for some stuff that you might be happening inside the panel. But as soon as you start doing it, you realize that there's some unwritten rules to that. Like, if the word balloon only pokes through the top and doesn't poke through one of the side, and you cut it off up there, it's going to look dumb. Yeah. It just looks bad. And if you've got 3 word balloons in there and you're only doing it with one of them and the other ones, intersect with the panel borders themselves, that also looks bad, right? And you, once you start doing this, you find out all kinds of like stuff that you can't find in a book. I was just paging through Nate Picos's book while you were talking, and I was trying to find, and I might not have found it. It might be in there, but I couldn't find anything that speaks to this specifically, and that is that there's an aesthetic value to word balloons. A great one. We were talking about it, Dave, just before the show. I will not put a word balloon in a single panel comic. I just won't. And the reason is there a rule? Is there a guideline? No, I think it looks bad.
Aesthetically, to you, that just looks weird. Yeah,
it looks, and I'll put words that'll float, like J-Lark says, float, and then I'll put like a little word balloon tail pointing up from the speaker. But 9 chances out of 10, if there's any speaking at all in a single panel, I'll put it in the caption. If it's got to have 2 sets of speech, then I'll never do a word balloon.
Yeah.
And that comes down to aesthetics.
And, going along with those aesthetics, let's talk about more situations where just weird choices are made. I will at times do a word balloon less text presentation where it's just floating text and then a line down towards the mouth, right? When I do that, it's usually for space reasons, but also, which basically comes down to aesthetics, because I don't want the panel to feel crowded. So if I already have 2 existing word balloons up towards the top, usually for that 3rd word balloon, I will take the balloon out and just have free floating text on a clear background. But that also presents its own problems when you're coloring or printing in the sense that you want to make sure that it's 100% clear background, or else, because legibility. And again, this goes back to the utilitarian nature of word balloons. Legibility beats everything in a comic strip. If people can't read your comic, then they can't read your comic. So the legibility of words and the presentation of words is so important. But another thing to step back on even more is have a look at 17th or 18th century comics like Gilray, Hogarth, Cruikshank in the UK. And you will notice something very specific as soon as you look at them, which is you can tell as an artist that they were drawn first or laid out first, and then the words were added later. And only in the 20th century did cartoonists kind of flip the script on that and go, oh, wait a minute, no, I have to do my lettering first and then flow everything else around it, because the legibility is so important. That's the main thrust of the comics. Even though everything we do after that fact, we try to hide the fact that there's these floating words inside of our comic, right? We try to downgrade it. But that legibility is the central crux of the comic strip, because you got to be able to read it. So you find mid-century, 20th century cartoonists like Schultz, the lettering so clearly went down first on the comic strip, and then everything else was drawn around it. You would do either push-up, close-in on Linus, because there wasn't a lot of space, so it would be just a free-floating head of Linus. You'd have a pullback shot of Woodstock way back, because it allowed for more space, because there were less words in that panel. Right. Basically, Schultz would choose his art based on how much space he had left, which is another utilitarian thing about word balloons, is that they've got to go first and then everything else can go afterward.
Yeah. And that's where it gets a little bit sticky here, Dave, because when we start talking aesthetics, I know from experience is that the next question we're going to get is, how do I learn aesthetics? Yeah. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I don't know how to teach you aesthetics. Right. I don't know how to put that in it's like if you were a cook and you were slathering salt all over everything that you were serving, and your customers were saying, this tastes horrible, it's all salty. And you'd be like, oh, but I think that tastes good. Right. I don't know how to get that cook to taste different. And I don't know how to get you to see different. The best thing I can tell you is to expose yourself to as much really high level, good professional comic art as possible, and do what we all probably did at the very beginning, mimic those as much as you can. Yes. Right.
I was going to say mimicry is your friend here, and literally go through the Eisner list of the last 10 years and figure out who was the best letterer, and then figure out what they worked on in the year that they won the Eisner for best lettering, because very often best letterer will also be coupled with best use of word balloons, best placement, best stylization of word balloons. Again, though, you could also go back to the greats. Schultz, very clean and easy. Watterson, very clean and easy word balloons. Trudeau, very clean and easy word balloons in Doonesbury. Literally mimic them, and mimic them for about 5 to 10 years. No one will notice, and even more importantly, no one will care, but it will give you a huge leg up towards your own word ballooning, because it's not an automatic for the brain. So mimicry is actually your friend here in terms of teaching yourself the aesthetics, which are very weird, because like you might be saying, well, do I do rounded square word balloons like Watterson, or do I do actually pointy squares like Mad Magazine? And you're like, I mean, that's 100% an aesthetic choice. No one can tell you which one's the better way to go. I mean, I can. Don't do Mad Magazine. That's weird. It was always weird. I don't know why Mad Magazine did square. It was always weird. But what I'm getting at is no one can tell you what your aesthetic is. And so what I would recommend is use and implement your mimicry of what you already naturally are gravitating to, which is probably the comic strips you grew up with and loved, or the comic books you grew up with and loved. Use that, mimic that, and in so doing, you will eventually build your own aesthetic of word balloons.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Dave, we've got another question we're going to move over to because here's another one that I think has a lot of importance to it. This one's coming in from our Patreon backer, Eddie DeAngelini, who says, I've run 4 successful Kickstarters in the past, and I'm about to launch a new one soon. One thing that I've not utilized much on my previous ones are stretch goals. What makes a good stretch goal, and what are the best practices or recommendations for them? Dave, let's talk about stretch goals.
So in my mind, a stretch goal does 2 things. It makes the final product of the thing that the people are going to get better, right? That's one aspect of it. And then also, in chasing that goal of making the final product better, you're also encouraging people to spread the word. Right. You're encouraging people to upsell themselves into the next tier, and then you're encouraging people to bring in friends to also upsell them on the tier with the goal of, hey, if we get to, I don't know, $20,000, everyone gets a built-in ribbon bookmark, or hey, if we get to $30,000, everyone gets a series of 9 prints, whatever it's going to be, something physical or concrete, at least if it's digital. Concrete that you can point to and say, I didn't have this before, but now that we've reached this goal, we are going to get this thing. So it encourages enthusiasm. It encourages self-marketing. People go out and tell their friends. It encourages people to up their own price for what they're willing to pledge for. I find them incredibly useful. How about you, Brad?
I think they're useful but dangerous. I see a lot of people using stretch goals in a way that I think is unwise. And if we go back to like the early days of Kickstarter, we know a lot of people who got themselves into a world of hurt through stretch goals because they weren't using them wisely. So yes, stretch goals can be super useful. Be very careful. You have, once you get into stretch goals, you've got 2 ways of doing it. You can do it one way where that stretch goal, the cost for it is something you've already figured out and is actually secretly hidden inside the original goal. Right? You've already called your shot. You've already got the price for that ribbon, or the cost rather. You've already got that built into the goal. You're not saying that out loud, but you're saying if we get to this next point, then we can add the ribbons. You've already added it. And by the way, I think that happens probably more than you think. And I think it's smart, because the last thing you want with a stretch goal is adding on something that you flubbed the cost on, and now you're losing money on the deal, or paying out of pocket, even worse, right? Now, if you want to, you could do it the second way, and that is that you've very carefully priced out the full cost. That's not only additional cost of merchandise, of building it, but also the cost of shipping to you, and the extra cost of what weight is that going to change? Is that going to increase the shipping out to the customer? You very carefully figured that out, and you've got that built into your stretch goal with a buffer. That's the other way to do it.
Yeah, unapologetically, that's the way I do it. I build it out. I build out my own financials such that, okay, I'm going to do this book, and let's pretend that all of these stretch goals have already been met. Right. So with the Drive book, that meant a second dust cover jacket. That meant metal foil on the inner jacket. That meant spot UV on the outer jacket. That meant a built-in ribbon bookmark. That meant end papers. Now, all that just is words to you, I know, but each one of those adds $1 here, $3 here. Like it adds cost to the book. So I priced it out knowing that I was going to get there, right? Because the alternative is to find that you're coming up short financially at the end of a Kickstarter, which is the exact opposite point of what a Kickstarter is supposed to be. Remember, this is a way for your audience to get something cool that they love while also supporting the continuing life of the comic strip that they enjoy. And so if you're financially not sound at the end of this, i.e. making a profit, you've borked the whole thing. That's the whole point of this damn thing. So don't come up short. So anyway, and also remember that I price that stuff in because, and with a buffer, because in the last couple of years, I have had extra warehousing fees that no one expected because it was a pandemic. I had fuel surcharges that no one expected because Russia invaded Ukraine. I had new import taxes that kind of didn't kick in until right as my Kickstarter ended. That was a bummer. What I'm saying is all these little things add up. And so, yes, absolutely build in these costs from the start and then work towards the stretch goal as you go through the Kickstarter. It's frankly the only good way to go, I think.
If you're not really strategically prepared to call your shot with a stretch goal. Like if you haven't really done the math on it and figured out all the permutations, I'd rather see you do a Kickstarter without a stretch goal and find other ways to generate excitement and publicity and so forth.
Fair.
I'd rather see you stay away from the stretch goal and just doing a good old fashioned honest Kickstarter than I would like to see you do the other one where you add all these Kickstarter stretch goals in and then find yourself in a world of hurt.
I just like the phrase good old fashioned Kickstarter, just as though it's like, well, around here we have a good old fashioned Kickstarter. None of these newfangled city Kickstarters. We have the old, just like Mama used to make. It's a Kickstarter for the whole family. That's a good old fashioned Kickstarter. Anyway, no, I'm with Brad on that. That if you're not prepared to, and also, make it easy on yourself. Like a lot of these stretch goals don't make it where it's extra work for you. That's, again, not the point of that. The point of this is to bring in more profit and to make the readers happier. If it's extra work for you that in any way limits your future work being done or keep you from doing present work, that's not the good point of a Kickstarter. You want it to be work that's already done, or things that can be rolled in, or free ebooks, or free digital items, or free small items that pack flat and are cheap to make, but of high quality, so that your readers are happy, you're happy. That's the goal. Don't make it hard for yourself. Don't make it expensive for yourself. The stretch goal is just meant to up the overall level of the profit while making everybody happy.
Dave, that's a great point. And speaking of points, you've got to tell us about some pins on the ComicLab update.
Oh, that transition was smooth as butter. Well, yes, just a reminder for everyone going to San Diego, the San Diego Comic Book Convention in San Diego, California. Fantastic. For anyone going to San Diego Comic-Con, just a reminder that you can get a free ComicLab pin. It says, "Let's Talk Comics," and it's really cute. It came out fantastic. You can get a free one at booth 1228. Just come up and let me know that you're a listener of the show, and I will happily shake your hand or maybe give you a fist bump. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet at Comic-Con. And then we'll get a free booth. So that is update number 1, my friend. And what is update number 2 that we got for everybody?
This comes in from John Backdurf, who goes by Durf, who is an amazingly great cartoonist, who, by the way, I shared a desk with at the Akron Beacon Journal when I first got hired there. Many, many years ago. Durf tweeted that Gannett Incorporated, who owns the bulk of United States newspapers, has announced that it's eliminating opinion pages from all of its newspapers, and thereby, according to Durf's tweet, quote, thus eliminate paying clients for syndicated cartoonists and columnists. Continuing the quote on the next tweet here, Gannett previously fired all of its staff political cartoonists in an earlier company-wide slash and burn. Pretty much the last income stream for political cartoonists is syndication. Guess that's over. Final nail in the coffin? I fear so, unquote. Dave, things do not look good for editorial cartoonists in this country right now.
So Gannett owns 100 daily newspapers and 1,000 weekly newspapers. That is a huge percentage of what's left in the U.S.
Yeah.
100 daily newspapers and 1,000 week. Boy, if the writing wasn't on the wall for editorial cartoonists, I mean, this is literally... It's not even writing on the wall. It's someone has now killed you with the pen. Like there's no longer a career in editorial cartooning going forward. I don't know where they go from here. Because I aside from maybe Patreon, of which 1 or 2 people are doing very well with it, with their editorial cartooning, I don't know where the average editorial cartoonist goes. Honestly, speaking honestly.
No, I've had that conundrum for the longest time because, as you know, my roots were in political cartooning. That's where I really kind of developed a love for the craft. And I don't know outside. It's one of those things that is so tied to how a newspaper is delivered. In other words, the whole idea of a political cartoonist is it gets presented to you whether you agree with that political slant or not, and you're exposed to it. And you either say, oh, that's a great point, or you say, that's a horrible point, and you get all, invested in the conversation.
Right.
Online, if you see something that you don't like, you just unfollow the person, and that's it. And if you see somebody you do like, maybe you hit the like button, but you've got to really be invested in that person before you become a Patreon backer or subscribe to a newsletter or any of those other things. And it's really hard to make a living when you're kind of preaching to the choir, because the only people who have an appreciation for you are the people that already agree with you.
Yeah.
Do they agree enough to pay money to say, yeah, I agree? I don't know. Like you said, there's a couple that are pulling it off.
There are a couple that are pulling it off. And is it possible? Absolutely. But much like you, what editorial cartoons are often selling is vitriol or bile.
Yeah. Yeah.
Intentionally, because you fight the powers that be with vitriol and bile, but it's hard to sell that, if you know what I mean. Like, it's hard to get someone to go, let me get my wallet out because I'm now sad about the state of the world. This is, you know what I mean? Like, optimism sells better is what I'm getting at, and so entertainment sells better. And unless someone is so politically motivated that they love an attitude and want to see more of it in the world by financially supporting it. And that exists, that absolutely exists. But I'm just saying it's a harder road to walk for editorial cartoonists, I think, with Patreon than it is for a lot of other people.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
Well, Brad, turning us back to Patreon for a second, I've got a question that I want to ask you, actually, because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in regards to my own Patreon. Having redesigned the Drive website, I was like, you know what? Actually, this is a good, because it's got such a tie-in with the Patreon API, largely, in fact, 100% due to you, with thanks to you. Because the new website ties into Patreon so much, I was like, you know what? What better time to sort of revamp, revitalize, refresh my Patreon page? Because, sometimes those things get set it and forget it, and you don't touch it. And one of the things that I was looking at was the milestone goals on Patreon. Now, those are the things, for those that aren't familiar with Patreon, that's the, hey, if we get to 100 people, or hey, if we get to $500, then blankety blank will happen. And it's either, you'll get more songs a week, or you'll get more comics per month, or you'll get, hey, now it'll be in color, or, whatever you can imagine a milestone goal being. But my question to you was, especially holding up milestone goals compared to Kickstarter stretch goals and comparing the two. For the most part, an individual backer on Patreon can't influence a milestone goal in the same way that they can on Kickstarter. For the most part, there's obviously there's ways they could do it, but they could spread the word. They could sort of up their amount and their personal pledge. But for the most part, the average person can't really influence a Patreon milestone goal, I think.
Yeah.
But in general, I wanted to ask you, do milestone goals on Patreon still work? Am I kidding myself that that's still a workable, worthwhile thing? Or was that a thing that Patreon launched with and we all jumped on, so it was something to talk about, but maybe doesn't really serve a useful purpose on Patreon?
I'm not a huge fan of Patreon milestone goals. And I think part of it is that it is kind of a parallel to that whole stretch goal thing. And there's a definite parallel in that you announce a stretch goal or you announce a milestone goal, and your backer can either up their pledge or go to a higher tier, or more likely they can go out on social media and say, hey, everybody join this thing because this good thing is going to happen if we reach this goal.
Right.
That's really powerful in a Kickstarter, for one reason and one reason only, and that is that there's a limited time for the Kickstarter. There's that time element that gives you a certain sense of urgency. Well, there's not a sense of urgency in a Patreon that goes month after month after month.
There's not. Yeah.
So as a result, that stretch goal is powerful. The milestone goal, not only is it not as powerful, but in a milestone goal, you often have this, and you see this all the time, where the milestone goal was like set at $300 a month, right?
Right.
And now the Patreon has grown to, let's say, $2,000 a month.
Right.
But you still have that milestone goal saying, well, if we reach 300, and it kind of makes you look bad because it's like, well, listen, what's next? Don't we get more prizes for getting to higher numbers together as a community? In fact, if you look at a lot of Patreon pages that you go to, I think even Patreon themselves have kind of stepped back from the milestone goal because you see it gets pushed further and further down.
You're right. It does get pushed down the page, doesn't it? Yeah.
It's gotten decentralized. It's gotten de-emphasized. And I think that's because in general, they're not as big of a part of Patreon as it was with that urgency run Kickstarter.
Well, and tell me if I'm wrong about thinking about it this way. With Kickstarter, it's a concrete, or better to say, discrete period of time.
Yeah.
So to your earlier emphasis, there's a focus point. There's a driver in time that, look, we have 30 days to do X, Y, Z, right? Come on, everybody, let's go.
Yeah.
Patreon doesn't have that, but also you have this problem. Let's say I set a really specific and awesome goal when I get to 100 backers, right? If we get to 100 backers, then we're gonna do Sunday color comics or whatever it is. It doesn't matter, right? But so I get to 100. Okay, great. Oh my God, I'm doing this 100 color. But we all know at the end of every month, there's a fluctuation of 2 to 5% every month in Patreon. It could go 2 to 5% up, 2 to 5% down. But okay, so now let's say you have a 6-month period where some days you're at 98, some you're at 101, some you're at 102. Now you're back to 97. Well, shit, what do you do for that weird 6-month period where you're at the goal, not at the goal, at the goal, not at the goal, at the goal? It could drive you and your readers bonkers because with Kickstarter, 99.99% of the time with Kickstarter, once you've reached a certain thing, it really takes a lot. Like you almost have to self-immolate on social media for people to back out of a Kickstarter, right? Like once you've reached a certain goal, you kind of are there to go. But it's not the same on Patreon. Right. You can have people just for the casualness of life, in and out at the end of every month. And you can both make and then decross that line again every month for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. And that seems horrifying to me. It's like, well, I guess we are going to have Sunday color comics. No, we're not going to have Sunday color comics.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, and then what do you do? Do you take that goal away? Like if you're at 100 for 2 months and then you're at 90 for 3 months, do you take away that goal for 3 months? Do you punish your community? That's not a great option to do that. So I'm not crazy about that. And also setting up that milestone goal sets the table for something that we both really have tried to convince people not to do when it comes to Patreon. And that's to talk about what's in it for me, the creator, instead of what's in it for you, the patron. And what I mean specifically is you see this a lot. If we reach, $500, then I can get a new computer. Well, that's great for you, the creator. You get a new computer, but what's in it for the people that are paying the money? They are like you. When they spend their money, they want to get things. And yes, you can do this long, circuitous logic that you getting a new computer means that they get better comics or they get comics more timely or whatever. But they don't see things that way, right? They want to know what's in it for me.
Right. And then specifically talking about, like, let's say you're doing the pitch of what's in it for you and you're talking about all the things you're going to get. Yeah. Well, if you followed Brad's excellent advice on Patreon, you've got sneak peeks, you've got exclusives, you've got early reads, you have all sorts of things, fan interaction, all the things that you do on a daily, weekly, monthly basis for that Patreon to make it grow and prosper, right? Which brings me to that comedy saying of it feels like a hat on a hat. I don't know if you know that phrase in the wider world, folks. In comedy, people often say a hat on a hat means a joke that's too clever because you've put a joke on top of a joke. And in so doing, you've kind of ruined both. So better to just go out on the blow, i.e. wear one hat, than wear a hat on a hat, which is two jokes on top of each other. Anyway, when you have a milestone goal on top of all these monthly deliverables that you're already giving, and that should be and are the main driver for that Patreon, it's a little bit hat on a hat. It's weird that these milestone goals are also floating out there when really the emphasis in all of your marketing has been these monthly, weekly, daily deliverables, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really where it should be, is on the deliverables. You've got to focus on what's in it for your backers. So yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with you. I'm not very big on the milestone goal. I think we all, like you said, started them early on. Yep. But I think there's better ways. In fact, I would even say that there's definitely better ways of creating excitement, creating enthusiasm without getting wrapped up in milestone goals.
Yeah, I mean, I have two, maybe three Patreons between ComicLab, Sheldon, and Drive. Yeah. All of which I think are now the sort of legacy Patreons because they were started, I don't know, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, whatever it was. And so all of them sort of have the milestone goal, I think. No, they do.
Oh, I know,
A part of me wishes I could quietly depublish them and just get rid of them. You know, because they don't serve a purpose now. I don't push them. The audience doesn't ask about them. But there's always that one person that's like, you said in 1999 that if you got to this goal, you would provide everyone with a turkey, you know? And you're like, oh, geez, thanks, Greg. I'm so glad you were paying attention to that. But is there an effective way to quietly depublish them? Because I don't know that anyone's actively waking up in the morning going, oh, have we reached that milestone goal yet? You know, I don't know.
No, I don't, that I know of. There's no way of making that just disappear. I got a feeling that at some point Patreon's just going to kind of quietly shuffle it right off. Yeah. But no, as far as I know, there's no way of making it disappear. It's just going to sit there and linger.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, my advice for folks starting Patreons or who have new Patreon that haven't really gotten your head of steam behind you yet is maybe reconsider having a milestone goal. I don't, unlike, you know, and it might be, you might say, well, Dave and Brad, actually, this milestone goal is a great marketing thing for me. I'm really pushing it. It's working. Yeah. We're getting close to it, and it's helping me grow either my patron count or my, monthly income. So listen, go with God if it works for you. I just think in general, I kind of wish that I hadn't used milestone goals. And in general, I don't know that they work for Patreon as well as stretch goals work for Kickstarter.
I agree 100%. Now, Dave, that brings us to this part of the show that I've been waiting for all week. We've got a question about our favorite syndicated comic panel, Ziggy. Are you ready?
I thought you were going to say Hagar the Horrible. Okay, it's Ziggy.
No, listen to this. This comes in anonymously, by the way.
Anonymously? Oh my goodness. Is it from the creator of Ziggy? Is it Tom Wilson writing in?
As far as I can tell, no, but you never know. There might be all kinds of machinations. But this one comes in and it says the following. Ziggy is one of my mother's favorite comics. Growing up, we had tons of comics in the house, and Ziggy books were one of them. Whenever the topic of Ziggy came up, my mother would always smile, and it was clear to me she genuinely loved this character. I never really understood this as a child, as the majority of the strips either made no sense to me because they made pop culture references that I didn't know, or they involved grown-up situations like overdue mortgage payments and bad credit scores, or they just seemed melancholy. As a child, I struggled with some Charlie Brown punchlines for the same reason. Watching Charlie Brown be sad was never funny to me. Now, however, I think I get it. I've been a long-time listener to this show, and I don't know if I have heard more howls of laughter than whenever the topic of Ziggy comes up. Hearing the two of you laugh and laugh at this comic character and come up with endless Ziggy jokes has helped me to realize just how funny this comic actually is. So here's my question to you, Dave Kellett. Since Ziggy seems to be one of your favorite comics too, is it not true that in fact Ziggy is actually one of the most underrated comics of all time? Has there ever been a comic that has made you laugh more than Ziggy?
I tell you what, the very framing of that question I find enjoyable.
Yes.
David Kellett, I put to you, is Ziggy the greatest comic ever made? I posit, some might put Shakespeare at the top of the English language penultimate work, but no, I would posit that it's Ziggy. Listen, I will be honest about this because it's a fun little jaunt down memory lane to talk about this. Every year, I think I've mentioned this before, I grew up in Southern California. All of my extended family was on the East Coast. And every year, my 7 brothers and sisters and I would pile into a van with my parents, and we would drive across the country and go visit my grandparents and my cousins on the East Coast. It was a wonderful summers. It was so fun to spend with my family, great memories. But one of my favorite memories is my grandmother, rest her soul, who knew I loved comic strips, would save the Sunday funnies for 52 weeks every year. So that when I got there, little 8 or 9-year-old me could curl up on the floor and everyone would leave me alone and I would just read 52 weeks of comics. And it was just pure joy when I went to visit. Pure joy. And like the act of love of them saving those comic pages every week for 52 weeks, like that, it touches me so much as an adult and the more I think about it. But they also had a huge supply of Haggard the Horrible, Broomhilda, and Ziggy books. And I'm saying this quite sincerely. They just had them lying around. I think they were sort of dime store, Goodwill, or, Disabled American Veterans kind of a store that you could buy, cheap old books. And so I would read the Beetle Baileys and I did love them. They were, listen, unapologetically, Ziggy has a place in my heart. Unapologetically. But older me, cartoonist me who sees the construction of Ziggy's, I think that's what Brad and I are really laughing at is the way how you can sort of nail the mood of the average Ziggy by just going, Brad and I will we'll throw one another on the spot and be like, hey, what's your favorite Ziggy punchline? I'll be like, well, I'm 50 years old and I have to say the first 50 were the hardest. I'm Ziggy. I'm Ziggy.
I finally I finally talked my girlfriend into sexting. Just my luck, I got writer's block. I'm Ziggy. No, you know what? I think, though, however, we may have to admit that just based on the amount of laughter that this comic has brought to us, technically, this guy's got us on the ropes. We may have to admit that this is the funniest comic of all time. There's no other, David, there's no other comic that is, listen, you can say it's an unintentional laugh, but you know as well as I do in comedy, a laugh is a laugh. Well, yeah. If you walk up on stage and fall down on your face and get a laugh, you've stopped becoming an intellectual comedian and now you're doing pratfalls for the rest of your career. It's now a laugh is a laugh, and Ziggy has gotten more laughs out of us than any other comic.
Well, okay. Yes, I agree with you that a serotonin hit is a serotonin hit, whether it comes accidentally or intentionally. So let me ask you, though, quite seriously, how would you rank Ziggy in the pick? Because in the 70s and 80s, Brad, in the average Hallmark store, Ziggy sold a shit ton of greeting cards and books and calendars and mugs, a lot of mugs. So how do you rate Ziggy in the pantheon of American comics? Quite seriously.
Wow. Okay, definitely not top 5, and I wouldn't say top 10, right? Because you've got a lot of competition for that space, right? You've got immediate shoe-ins are Calvin and Hobbes, Peanuts, Doonesbury, Bloom County. I even put Broomhilda in the 70s ahead. So you've got a lot of competition for that top 10. But I'd say Ziggy was a top 20 in the pantheon of comics history. I'd put Ziggy top 20.
I might too. I'll tell you what we're going to get serious about Ziggy for a minute because what the hell, why not? This question is asking us to be serious. Yeah. Here's what I will tell you. Ziggy 100% represents a moment in American history. Yes. And I'll tell you what I mean. Gasoline Alley was about, like we were talking about Brad growing up in Bad Axe, where everybody knew everybody's story. That's what Gasoline Alley was. Gasoline Alley was about growing up in a small town America where everybody knew your story and you were interrelated to like 30 different people and they were all either a cousin or married in or, all that sort of stuff. Yep. Blondie was about marrying a flapper and suddenly having wealth, right? Yeah. And suddenly having to deal with all that, or, having wealth and suddenly having to deal with flapper culture. Before it became big sandwiches and sleeping on the couch, that's what Blondie was about. It represented a moment in history, in American history. Bringing Up Father was about Irish Americans immigrating to America with not a nickel in their pocket, and then within 10 years having ridiculous amounts of wealth, and suddenly being old money, but yet having all the culture of someone that came from a small village in Ireland. That legit happened in Boston and in Philly and in New York, right? Yeah. And so that comic strip represented that moment in American history. Ziggy represents people in the 60s and 70s moving to large towns, not having anyone in their life. They're living in one-bedroom apartments, and they have pets. It was the first comic strip to talk about loneliness that came from city living. That's the honest-to-God truth. That is what Ziggy is about in American history, is about moving to a big city, feeling alone, talking to your pets, living in your one-bedroom apartment, being kind of sad. That's what it was. You didn't have family. You didn't have small town around you. You didn't have the sports teams that you played with when you were a kid. You didn't have the church groups that you had when you were a kid. You're living in a big city by yourself, being sad. That's what Ziggy was about in the 70s.
Holy cats! I'm wobbling from that one. That is. I've never connected all of those dots, but you're absolutely right. And of course, the art style being as minimalist and as broad as it is meant that an awful lot of people could potentially import their thoughts into that character. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And feel that same loneliness.
And we've talked about this before, how we would absolutely put Kathy in the pantheon of the top 20 comic strips in America, in large part for similar reasons. Kathy was all about American corporations finally opening their door to American women. And what a huge pain in the ass all of that was for the average woman coming into a corporate life in America, right? Right. And for the first 10, 15 years of Kathy, it was freaking stinging. That comic was great. Yeah. And then it settled down into more tropish stuff towards the end. But Kathy, to all due credit, that was a fascinating comic strip about American culture and the moment of its time. Anyway, I think Ziggy is very much about moving to big cities, being alone in your one-bedroom apartment, and talking to your pets, because life sucks in the big city by yourself. I'm Ziggy.
All of a sudden, I got to start respecting Ziggy. I don't know what I'm going to do with this. We started out on the other side. We might have to nudge Ziggy at least into the top 15 now, right? Taking this new construct into effect.
Are you a little bit taken aback that I actually had a serious response to the question about Ziggy?
Especially since I planned to completely catch you by surprise with this topic. So I know you haven't planned this. This has been rattling around in your head on its own.
No, this was largely just a response to this question, was like, let's play Ziggy. Because I always think about Bloom County was a very specific moment where pop culture ruled, and that's why it doesn't date well. It played perfect in the 80s because pop culture ruled in the 80s America. You started having magazines that were fan-oriented, like Nintendo Gaming Magazine or Atari Magazine. No matter what, there was a D&D magazine, and it was all pop culture and fan-oriented. That started in the 80s, and Bloom County was a part of that. So it's really fun to sort of place comic strips within the wider culture that was happening at their time,
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, listen, all we can hope for ourselves, I guess, is that we can place our podcast in a wider culture of our time and tell you that this time next week, we'll be back here with another episode of ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my friend Ziggy, who was one of the top 15, 20 comic strips in America, and my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And my good friend Dave Kellett, the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
And the ComicLab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love ComicLab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode like this one. This one comes in 5-star review, says, Sublime Sequentialist. Listen to this. ComicLab is everything a podcast could hope to be. Informative, entertaining, engaging, professional, absurd, and regular. By the way, I like that last one.
Regular, as though
It's
we're
good to be
fiber. I don't know
regular.
what that is.
I don't know, but that Fiber One has been doing its job. Brad Guigar and the notable Dave Kellett are a font of comic knowledge, and anyone who wants to seriously get their toes into the world of making comics should pay them heed. They're also delightfully entertaining, real voices for radio, so even if you don't give a fig about comics, you're in for an auditory treat. Give them a listen and follow their advice. They know what they're about.
Wow, that was incredibly kind.
That was really nice.
I'm always really chuffed when someone takes the time to write that. And don't forget, by the way, not just on Apple Podcasts, but also over on Spotify, which for whatever reason, ComicLab is doing really well on Spotify. And I think part of that is because the ratings matter more and the write-ups matter more. So if you could take a moment, if you're a Spotify listener, to head over and give us a little review over there, that would be much appreciated. But I will say, ComicLab is made possible by your support at patreon.com/ComicLab. So we'll go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/I'm one of the most important comic strips in American history. I'm Ziggy. Brad, I should end the show by just reminding everybody of my personal favorite Ziggy punchline, which I think it captures Ziggy perfectly in a nutshell. And it goes a little something like this. Friends, don't forget to stay ready so you don't have to get ready. Unfortunately, I'm ready to go. I'm Ziggy.
I'm Ziggy.